The boy stood in the heavy silence of the courtroom, wearing a hoodie that had seen better days and sneakers held together by duct tape. To everyone watching, he was just another statistic, another delinquent from the projects destined for a cell. Judge Harrison Sterling certainly thought so. He laughed at the boy's trembling hands, mocked his silence, and prepared to throw the book at him for defacing public property. But the judge didn't know that the scribbles on the wall weren't graffiti. They were a warning. And by the time the gavel came down, that poor boy wouldn't just be walking free, he would be the only one left standing. This is the story of how a hidden genius brought a corrupt empire to its knees. The air in the courtroom of the 14th District smelled of lemon polish, old paper, and fear. It was a smell that Judge Harrison Sterling had grown to love over his 30-year career. It was the scent of power. Sterling sat high on his mahogany bench, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit beneath his robe. He checked his watch, a gold Patek Philippe that cost more than most of the defendants in his courtroom would earn in a lifetime. It was 3:45 p.m. on a Friday. He had a tea time at the exclusive Oakhaven Country Club at 5 last p.m. with the district attorney, and he was in no mood for delays. "Next case," Sterling barked, his voice booming without the need for a microphone. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Miller, stepped forward. "Docket number 4492B, the State versus Elijah Washington. Charges: felony trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of university property." The heavy oak doors creaked open, and the defendant was led in. Elijah Washington was 17, though he looked younger due to malnutrition. He was thin, his wrists bony where the handcuffs chafed his dark skin. He wore a faded grey hoodie, oversized jeans that dragged on the floor, and dirty white sneakers wrapped in silver duct tape. He kept his head down, eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, his posture screaming submission. Beside him walked his court-appointed public defender, Beatrice Kinsley. She was young, overworked, and currently juggling 40 other cases. She looked exhausted, clutching a file that was suspiciously thin. "Mr. Washington," Judge Sterling sneered, looking over his spectacles. He didn't see a human being. He saw a nuisance. He saw a stain on his schedule. "You are charged with breaking into the theoretical physics lab at Columbia State University and defacing the walls with—" what does it says here? "Nonsensical markings and gang signs. Is that correct?" Elijah didn't answer. He just gripped the edge of the defendant's table, his knuckles turning ash grey. "Your Honor," Beatrice interjected, her voice shaky, "my client pleads not guilty to the count of malicious intent. We argue that—" "Save it, Ms. Kinsley," Sterling cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. He leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking. "I've seen this 1,000 times. A kid from the bottoms gets bored, breaks into a place of higher learning, a place he has no business being in, and decides to trash it because he's jealous that he doesn't belong there." The courtroom remained silent. A few people in the gallery, mostly family members of other defendants, shifted uncomfortably. "Look at him," Sterling continued, gesturing to Elijah with a pen. "Can't even look me in the eye. Tell me, son, can you even read the charges against you? Or do we need to get you a picture book?" A ripple of laughter came from the prosecutor's table. Thomas Kincaid, the state prosecutor, smirked. He was a man who played golf with the judge. He knew the game. Elijah slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, likely from a lack of sleep, but there was something behind them that Sterling missed. A sharpness, a calculation. "I can read, sir," Elijah whispered. His voice was raspy. "Speak up." Sterling hammered the gavel once, just to make the boy jump. Elijah flinched. "You're in a court of law, not a street corner. Address me as Your Honor." "I can read, Your Honor," Elijah repeated, louder this time. Good. Then you know you're facing 5 years in juvenile detention, followed by probation. For what? Drawing tag names on a whiteboard? Sterling shook his head, feigning disappointment. A waste of taxpayer money. You people always want the easy way out, don't you? Destruction is easier than creation. It was a cruel, racist dog whistle, and everyone in the room knew it. Beatrice opened her mouth to object to the judge's conduct, but Sterling glared her into silence. Let's get this over with, Sterling grumbled. Prosecution, present the evidence of the vandalism. I want to make my tea time. Thomas Kincaid stood up, buttoning his blazer. He projected an air of confident superiority. He didn't even need to try hard today. It was a slam dunk. Thank you, Your Honor, Kincaid said, smoothing his tie. On the night of October 14th, campus security at Columbia State University was alerted to a silent alarm in the Feynman wing. This is the restricted wing housing the Department of Advanced Energy Logistics. It is a secure facility. Kincaid picked up a remote and clicked it. A large monitor on the wall flickered to life. Security footage shows the defendant, Mr. Washington, picking the electronic lock on the rear service entrance. He bypassed a keypad system that requires a security clearance level of 4. Sterling raised an eyebrow. He picked an electronic lock? With what? A crowbar? No, Your Honor. Kincaid hesitated, checking his notes. He hot-wired the panel using a discarded vape battery and copper wire found in a dumpster. It took him less than 45 seconds. Sterling scoffed. A little thief with nimble fingers. Go on. Once inside, Kincaid continued, clicking to the next slide. The defendant did not steal computers. He did not steal copper piping. Instead, he went straight to the main laboratory, where Professor Arthur Hemlock, the leading consultant for the city's new Project Aegis energy grid, keeps his work. The screen changed to a photo of the crime scene. It was a massive room filled with whiteboards. The boards were covered in dense, terrifyingly complex mathematical formulas. But over the top of the professor's work, in bright red marker, someone had written new lines, crossed out variables, and drawn arrows rearranging the entire equation. This, Kincaid pointed dramatically, is the vandalism. Mr. Washington spent 3 hours in that room. When security found him, he was frantic. He was screaming that it wouldn't hold. He destroyed months of Professor Hemlock's work on the new city power grid. He covered the professor's derivation with this. Kincaid zoomed in on the red marker. To the average eye, it looked like chaos. Greek letters, brackets, and frantic squiggles. The total damages are estimated at $50,000 in lost research hours, Kincaid concluded. The university is furious. This boy broke into a high-security facility and treated a Nobel Prize nominee's work like a coloring book. Judge Sterling leaned back, shaking his head in disgust. He looked at Elijah with pure contempt. You think this is funny, boy? Sterling asked. You think destroying smart people's work makes you big? You think because you can't understand it, you have the right to ruin it? Elijah stood up. His legs were shaking, but his hands had stopped trembling. Sit down, the bailiff barked. No, Elijah said. The word rang out clear as a bell. Sterling's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? I said no, Elijah said, stepping away from his table. Beatrice grabbed his arm, whispering for him to stop, but he gently pulled away. He looked directly at the screen showing the red formulas. I didn't destroy it, Elijah said, his voice gaining strength. I fixed it. The courtroom erupted in laughter. It started with Kincaid, then the bailiffs, and finally, Judge Sterling let out a loud, barking guffaw. You fixed it? Sterling wiped a tear from his eye. Oh, this is rich. A high school dropout from the projects fixed the work of Professor Arthur Hemlock. A man who consults for the Department of Defense. A man who I personally know. He's wrong, Elijah said, pointing at the screen. And if you turn that grid on next week like the mayor plans to, people are going to die. The laughter died down, replaced by a tense, awkward silence. Sterling's smile faded. He didn't like the tone of the boy's voice. It wasn't the voice of a criminal. It was the voice of certainty. "Careful, son," Sterling warned, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You are adding perjury and contempt of court to your list. You have no education. You have no background. You are nobody." "I read the papers in the dumpster," Elijah said quickly. "The professor throws out his drafts. I've been reading them for 2 years. He missed a variable in the thermal load distribution. He's assuming a static load, but the grid fluctuates. The Langlands dual he used for the conversion, it's unstable." Sterling blinked. He didn't understand a word of that. But he recognized the confidence, and he hated it. "Enough of this gibberish." Sterling slammed the gavel. "I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus by a delusional vandal. Miss Kinsley, control your client, or I will have him bound and gagged." Beatrice Kinsley looked at her client with new eyes. She had assumed, like everyone else, that Elijah was just a troubled kid acting out. But she looked at the screen, then back at Elijah. "Your Honor," Beatrice said, standing up straighter, "I request a recess. My client has raised a claim regarding the validity of the evidence. If the vandalism is indeed a mathematical correction, then the intent to destroy property is null and void." "Denied!" Sterling roared. "This is absurd. I am not delaying this trial so we can entertain the fantasies of a child." "Actually," a voice boomed from the back of the courtroom, "I would like to hear what the boy has to say." The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open. A hush fell over the gallery. Walking down the center aisle was a man in a tweed jacket, his white hair wild and unkempt, holding a battered leather briefcase. He walked with a limp, using a cane, but his presence was commanding. It was Professor Arthur Hemlock, the victim. Kincaid, the prosecutor, smiled nervously. "Professor Hemlock, we didn't expect you today. We have the victim impact statement right here. You don't need to—" "I'm not here for the impact statement," Hemlock snapped. He walked past the prosecutor and stood directly in front of the defense table. He looked Elijah up and down. Judge Sterling cleared his throat. "Professor, while we are honored by your presence, you cannot just barge in here. We are in the middle of sentencing." "You haven't convicted him yet, Harrison," Hemlock said, addressing the judge by his first name. They moved in the same circles. "And I suggest you wait until you see this." Hemlock turned to the bailiff. "Give me the clicker." The bailiff looked at the judge. Sterling, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, but unable to silence a man of Hemlock's stature, nodded curtly. Hemlock took the remote and clicked back to the image of the whiteboard covered in red marker, Elijah's writing. "I was furious when I saw this," Hemlock admitted to the room. "I called the police immediately. I thought some gang member had just scribbled nonsense over 3 years of government-funded research." He paused, looking at Elijah. "Then, I actually looked at it. I sat down with a cup of coffee and I traced the red lines." Hemlock turned to the judge. "Harrison, are you aware of what the Riemann hypothesis is?" "I am a judge, Arthur, not a physicist," Sterling snapped. "Get to the point." "The point," Hemlock said, his voice trembling slightly, "is that I was trying to solve a stability issue in the Aegis grid for 6 months. I was stuck. I was using a linear approach." Hemlock pointed a shaking finger at Elijah. "This boy, this child, didn't just correct my math. He derived a new formula for non-linear thermal feedback, using a method I haven't seen since I studied at MIT in the 80s. and he did it with a dry erase marker in 3 hours. The courtroom was dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "Are you saying," Kincaid stammered, "are you saying the graffiti is correct?" "I'm saying," Hemlock said, "that without this vandalism, the Aegis grid would have suffered a catastrophic thermal runaway event within 48 hours of activation. It would have exploded, Harrison. It would have taken out 3 city blocks, including this courthouse." Beatrice Kinsley gasped. Elijah stood still, his face impassive. Judge Sterling's face turned a shade of purple. This wasn't going to plan. The thug was a hero. This didn't fit the narrative, and worse, it made Sterling look incompetent for mocking him. "Fine," Sterling said through gritted teeth. "So he's an idiot savant. That doesn't change the fact that he trespassed. He broke the law. We cannot reward criminal behavior just because it had a happy accident." Sterling leaned forward, his eyes cold. "I don't care if he invented time travel. He broke into a secure facility. The law is the law. Mr. Kincaid, I expect you to pursue the trespassing charges with full force." Elijah spoke again, softly. "I didn't just fix the thermal load, Professor." Hemlock turned to him. "What did you say?" "I checked the budget logs," Elijah said. "They were on the desk next to the whiteboard. I needed scratch paper for the calculus." Sterling froze. "The budget logs?" Sterling asked, his voice suddenly very tight. "Yeah," Elijah said, looking up at the judge. "The numbers regarding the construction materials, specifically the insulation contracts." Elijah walked slowly out from behind the table. This time, nobody stopped him. "The math for the grid only works if you use Grade A industrial shielding. That's what the taxpayer paid for. That's what the budget says." Elijah paused, tilting his head. "But the invoices on the desk? They were for Grade C residential shielding. Cheap stuff, flammable stuff." Elijah looked directly at Judge Sterling. "Someone swapped the materials and pocketed the difference, about $15 million. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just heavy anymore. It was dangerous. "That's enough!" Sterling shouted, standing up. "This is irrelevant. Hearsay. Bailiff, take the defendant into custody immediately." "Wait," Beatrice Kinsley said, her mind racing. She grabbed her laptop. "Elijah, what was the name of the company on the invoices?" "Sterling and Cobra Logistics," Elijah said. A gasp went through the courtroom. Every head turned toward the bench. Judge Harrison Sterling sat back down, his face draining of blood. The Sterling in the company name wasn't a coincidence. It was his wife's shell company. The poor black boy from the projects hadn't just solved a physics problem. He had just solved a crime. And the criminal was the man holding the gavel. The name Sterling and Cumberl Logistics hung in the air like a cloud of toxic gas. For a moment, time seemed to dilate. Judge Harrison Sterling, a man who had ruled his courtroom like a medieval fiefdom for 3 decades, looked as though he had been struck physically. His face, usually flushed with the arrogant heat of authority, drained to the color of wet parchment. Prosecutor Thomas Kincaid was the first to move. He took a subtle half-step away from the judge's bench, a predator's instinct telling him that the alpha was wounded and the pack was about to turn. "That is a lie," Sterling whispered, though his voice cracked. A malicious, slanderous lie fabricated by a criminal mind. "Is it?" Elijah asked. He didn't sound arrogant. He sounded tired. "Check the Secretary of State's business registry. It's public record. The LLC was registered 5 years ago. The registered agent is your wife, Martha Sterling. The address is a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands, but the routing number for the deposits, that goes to a bank in downtown, 2 blocks from here." "Silence!" Sterling shrieked, slamming the gavel down so hard the wooden handle splintered. "Bailiff, seize him. I want this courtroom cleared. I want the cameras off. I want the stenographer to strike the last 5 minutes from the record." Miller, the bailiff, hesitated. He looked at the judge, then at the boy, then at the professor. Miller had a pension to think about. But he also had a son about Elijah's age. "Bailiff!" Sterling screamed, veins bulging in his neck. Miller took a step toward Elijah, reaching for his cuffs. "Don't touch him," Beatrice Kinsley said. Her voice was no longer the shaky whisper of an overworked public defender. It was low, dangerous, and steady. She stepped in front of Elijah, shielding him with her body. "Miss Kinsley," Sterling hissed, "you are treading on thin ice. I will hold you in contempt. I will have you disbarred. I will make sure you never practice law in this state again." "If my client is telling the truth," Beatrice said, locking eyes with the judge, "then you have no authority here. You have a conflict of interest. In fact, you are the defendant." "I am the law," Sterling roared, standing up. "Not anymore," Professor Hemlock interrupted. He was typing furiously on his smartphone. "I just accessed the university's vendor portal. I have administrative privileges." Hemlock looked up, his face pale. "He's right. The insulation supplier is listed as Sterling Logistics. The contract was signed 3 months ago. The specifications were changed from aerogel-class thermal shielding to fiberglass composite. The difference in cost is," Hemlock swallowed hard, $12 million. "It's a clerical error," Sterling shouted, sweat now beading on his forehead. "My wife has nothing to do with my court. I didn't know." "You signed the inspection waivers," Elijah said. The room went deadly quiet again. "What?" Kincaid, the prosecutor, asked involuntarily. "The university requires a judicial waiver to bypass safety inspections for urgent government projects," Elijah explained, reciting the statutes from memory. Project Aegis was classified as urgent. The waiver was signed by a district judge to expedite construction. "The signature on the waiver is yours, Judge Sterling." Elijah tapped his temple. "I saw that on the desk too, underneath the pizza box." Sterling looked like a trapped animal. He looked at the exits. The gallery was buzzing. People were holding up phones. The judge realized with horror that this wasn't 1990 anymore. He couldn't just order the tapes destroyed. This was being live-streamed. "Confiscate the phones," Sterling ordered the 2 deputies by the door. "Nobody leaves. This is a closed session. National security." "It's not national security," Beatrice shouted over the noise. "It's fraud." "Arrest her!" Sterling pointed a shaking finger at Beatrice. "Arrest the boy. Arrest Hemlock for aiding and abetting." The 2 deputies at the back of the room looked at each other. They were local cops, not the judge's personal guard. They saw the phone cameras pointed at them. They saw the famous Professor Hemlock. They saw the writing on the wall. They didn't move. "You're all fired," Sterling screamed, his composure shattering completely. He was unraveling, a lifetime of unchecked power, dissolving in the face of a 17-year-old with a high school equivalency diploma and a dirty hoodie. "Mr. Kincaid," Sterling pleaded, turning to his golf buddy. "Do something. Prosecution moves to dismiss due to mental incompetence of the defendant." Kincaid looked at his shoes, then at the judge. He slowly closed his file. "Your Honor," Kincaid said coldly, "the state withdraws its objection to the defense's line of questioning. If there is evidence of exculpatory nature or criminal misconduct by the bench, it must be heard." "Et tu, brute!" Sterling slumped back in his chair, gasping for air. Elijah stepped forward again. "I can explain the math, Judge. If you want to know how the explosion would have happened, I can show you exactly how you were going to kill 10,000 people to buy a summer house in the Hamptons." The courtroom had transformed. It was no longer a place of judgment for Elijah. It was a classroom, and he was the teacher. The gallery, the lawyers, and even the bailiffs leaned in. Beatrice guided Elijah to the whiteboard that Kincaid had used earlier to mock him. She handed him a fresh marker. "Show us," she said softly. Elijah uncapped the marker. The smell of the ink seemed to center him. He began to write. He didn't write like a vandal. He wrote with the fluidity of a conductor leading an orchestra. "What fragment of tast, partial sash host of partial pa, as of was jalversion abla o te, plus our fractions war parts as per horo qx. This is the heat equation," Elijah said, his voice gaining a rhythm. "The professor's grid relies on a high thermal diffusivity, alpha, sulfur dodla. The aerogel shielding you paid for has an extremely low conductivity, meaning the heat stays contained within the core plasma." Elijah drew a sharp line through the variable talfa to lololith. But Sterling Logistics swapped the aerogel for fiberglass. Fiberglass degrades at 600 degrees Celsius. The plasma in the Aegis core runs at 4,000 degrees. He began furiously writing calculations, numbers flying across the board. When the insulation melts, the variable tolfadolol spikes. The heat doesn't dissipate. It floods the containment chamber. The pressure creates a feedback loop. Elijah turned to the crowd, his eyes blazing. "It's not just a fire. It's a thermal runaway. The entire city block becomes a bomb. The blast radius covers the university, the hospital next door, and the low-income housing projects across the street." He stopped. He capped the marker. The silence was heavy, wet with the realization of the horror they had narrowly avoided. "Why?" Beatrice asked. "Elijah, why were you there? Why did you care so much to risk jail?" Elijah looked down at his taped-up sneakers. The defiance faded, replaced by a profound sadness. "My Nana," he whispered. "Speak up, son," Professor Hemlock said gently. "My Nana," Elijah said, his voice cracking. "She raised me. We lived in the tenements on 4th Street. 2 years ago, during the heat wave, the power grid failed. It was an overload. The city said they had upgraded the substation, but it blew up." Elijah looked at Judge Sterling, who was now clutching his chest, breathing shallowly. The AC stopped. She was old. She had a heart condition. The ambulance couldn't get up the elevator because the power was out. I carried her down 12 flights of stairs. Elijah wiped a tear from his cheek with the rough sleeve of his hoodie. "She died in my arms on the 3rd floor landing. It was too hot. Her heart just stopped." He took a deep breath. "I promised her I wouldn't let it happen again. I started reading. I went to the library. I learned how the grid worked. I learned about voltage, about resistance, about corrupt politicians cutting corners on transformers." He pointed at the whiteboard. "When I heard about Project Aegis, I knew it was the new solution. I wanted to believe in it, so I snuck in to check the work. I just wanted to make sure it was safe. I just wanted to make sure no one else's Nana had to die in the dark." Elijah looked directly at Sterling. "But when I saw the invoices, when I saw you swapped the materials, I knew. You didn't care about the grid. You didn't care about the science. You just wanted the money. You were going to kill us all over again." Professor Hemlock wiped his eyes. Beatrice was openly crying. Even the hardened bailiff Miller looked away, ashamed. "You're a monster," a woman in the gallery shouted. "You killed that boy's grandmother." "Order," Sterling croaked, but his voice was weak. I demand—" "You demand nothing," Hemlock said, stepping forward. "Elijah, you said you fixed the equation. Show me the stabilization vector." Elijah nodded. He erased a section of the board and wrote a new complex function involving imaginary numbers. "Tortaps ixt. Ikex, Nomega T. Of racket beta shors alpha, lintar dots dos." "I introduced a dampening field," Elijah explained. If you run the current through a Mobius loop configuration, the magnetic field contains the excess heat. You don't need the expensive insulation if you change the geometry of the flow. It saves money and it's safer. Hemlock stared at the math. His mouth fell open. "My God," Hemlock whispered. "He's right. He solved the containment problem using topology. He didn't just fix the grid. He made the expensive materials obsolete." Hemlock turned to Sterling, a look of pure disgust on his face. "Do you understand, Harrison? This boy, this vandal, just saved the city $15 million legitimately. He found a way to do it better, for free. But because you wanted to steal the money for the materials, you almost destroyed everything." Sterling slumped forward, his head hitting the desk. He wasn't dead, but he was broken. The weight of his sins, exposed by the brilliance of the boy he mocked, was crushing him. But Elijah wasn't done. "There's one more thing," Elijah said. Beatrice looked at him. "What is it, Elijah?" "I knew you wouldn't believe me," Elijah said, looking at the police officers in the back. "I knew if I just went to the cops with the papers, they'd arrest me for stealing them. I knew if I posted it online, no one would read it." Elijah looked at the camera of the nearest smartphone in the gallery. "So I triggered the silent alarm on purpose." The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from a place of judgment to a theater of revelation. But just as the audience was processing the sheer magnitude of the fraud Elijah had exposed on the whiteboard, the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom didn't just open, they were thrown wide with a concussive force that rattled the window panes. The silence that followed was absolute, but only for a heartbeat. Then came the thundering sound of heavy boots against the linoleum floor. "Federal agents, nobody move! Hands where we can see them!" It was a tactical entry, precise and overwhelming. 6 figures moved into the room, moving with a synchronized fluidity that spoke of high-level training. They weren't wearing the standard beige uniforms of the county sheriff's department. They wore navy blue windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across the back and chest, FBI. The gallery erupted into panicked whispers, people shrinking back into their benches. Beatrice Kinsley instinctively put a hand on Elijah's shoulder, pulling him slightly behind her. But Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't look scared. He looked at the agents like a chess player watching his opponent finally realize they were in checkmate. Walking behind the tactical team was a woman who radiated a terrifying kind of calm. She wore a sharp, charcoal grey pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She carried nothing but a thin leather portfolio. She scanned the room, her eyes passing over the stunned bailiff, the cowering prosecutor, and finally locking onto the man sitting high on the bench. "Judge Harrison Sterling," she announced, her voice projecting clearly without a microphone. "I am Special Agent Clarissa Vaughan of the FBI's Public Corruption and Financial Crimes Division. We are securing this courtroom." Sterling stood up, his face a mask of indignation that was rapidly crumbling into terror. He banged his gavel, a futile, hollow sound against the sudden invasion of his sanctuary. "This is a state court," Sterling screeched, his voice cracking. "You have no jurisdiction here, Agent. I order you to stand down. Bailiff, remove these people." Miller, the bailiff, looked at the armed federal agents, then back at the judge. He slowly took his hand off his baton and stepped back against the wall, raising his hands. "I'm not doing that, Judge." "Jurisdiction is established when crimes cross state lines and involve federal infrastructure grants," Agent Vaughan said, walking calmly past the bar. She didn't look up at Sterling. She looked through him. "And conspiracy to defraud the Department of Energy of $15 million certainly qualifies. As does wire fraud. As does money laundering." 2 agents flanked the bench. They didn't ask Sterling to step down. They moved with the intent to drag him down if necessary. "You have no proof!" Sterling shouted, gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. "This is hearsay, the ramblings of a delinquent boy." Agent Vaughn stopped. She opened her portfolio. "We have the bank records from the Cayman Islands, Judge. The shell company, Sterling Logistics, received the wire transfer from the university 3 days ago. We also have the flight manifest for your wife, Martha Sterling." Sterling froze. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like a corpse. "Martha?" he whispered. "She was intercepted at JFK International Airport 45 minutes ago, attempting to board a flight to Zurich," Vaughn said coldly. "She had $3 million in bearer bonds in her carry-on. She's currently in custody, and she is very eager to cut a deal to avoid federal prison. She's talking, Harrison. She's telling us everything. The kickbacks from the private prisons, the construction fraud, the bribed inspectors." The courtroom gasped. The invincible titan of the 14th District was being dismantled in real time. "But that's not the only proof we have," Vaughn continued. She turned toward the defense table. "Mr. Washington?" Elijah stepped forward. He reached into the pocket of his worn gray hoodie and pulled out a cheap, cracked smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times and held it up. "You have a smart speaker in your chambers, Judge," Elijah said, his voice carrying through the silent room. "An older model. You linked it to your personal cloud account so you could dictate notes, but you never changed the default factory security settings." Sterling's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. "I didn't just read the papers on the desk," Elijah explained, his tone almost apologetic. "I accessed the cloud logs associated with the IP address of the speaker. It records whenever it hears a wake word, but it also records the 30 seconds prior to that if the buffer is full." Elijah pressed play. The audio was tinny, but unmistakably clear. It boomed through the quiet courtroom. "I don't care if the insulation is flammable, Tom. Just get the inspector to sign the waiver. We swap the aerogel for the fiberglass, pocket the $12 million, and by the time anyone notices the thermal leak, I'll be retired in the Hamptons. And if the grid blows? Who cares? It's only the projects. Those animals won't know what hit them until they cook." The recording ended with the sound of Harrison Sterling laughing. A cruel, wheezing laugh. The reaction in the room was visceral. It wasn't just shock, it was rage. A low, guttural roar began to rise from the gallery. These were the people from the projects. These were the animals he had spoken of. "You monster!" a mother in the front row screamed, lunging forward before being held back by a family member. "My babies live in those projects!" Sterling looked around wildly, realizing his protection was gone. Prosecutor Thomas Kincaid, realizing the ship was sinking, tried to subtly slip out the side exit. "Grab him!" Agent Vaughn barked without turning around. 2 agents intercepted Kincaid, slamming him against the wall and cuffing him before he could touch the door handle. "Judge Harrison Sterling," Vaughn said, mounting the steps to the bench. "You are under arrest." She didn't wait for him to comply. She grabbed the arm of his silk robe and yanked. Sterling stumbled, and the agents hauled him down from the high chair. The robe, a symbol of his unearned authority, snagged on the chair and tore open, leaving him looking disheveled and small in a sweat-stained dress shirt. They dragged him to the center of the room, right in front of the defense table. The agents kicked his legs apart and forced him down. Judge Sterling, the man who had sentenced thousands of young men to their doom without blinking, collapsed. His legs gave out. He fell to his knees on the scuffed linoleum floor. He was directly in front of Elijah Washington. The symbolism was so potent it felt scripted, but the raw emotion in the room was terrified and real. The powerful white judge, on his knees, looking up at the poor black boy he had mocked only an hour ago. Sterling looked up, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat of his fear. He looked at Agent Vaughan, then at the gallery, but he found no mercy. Finally, his desperate eyes locked onto Elijah. "Elijah," Sterling whimpered, his voice trembling. "Son, please, you're a smart kid. I see that now. We can work something out. I have money stashed away that they don't know about. I can pay for your college. I can make you rich." The room held its breath. Elijah looked down at the man. He didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant. He looked at Sterling with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "I don't want your money," Elijah said quietly, "and I'm not your son." "Please," Sterling begged, clutching at the hem of Elijah's jeans. "They'll put me in general population. You know what happens to judges in there. They'll kill me. You have to help me. You're a good boy, I can tell. Mercy. Show some mercy." Elijah reached into his pocket again. Sterling's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. Was he pulling out a phone to call someone? Was he going to ask the agents to go easy? Elijah pulled out a small, crumpled, rectangular piece of cardstock. It was dirty, bent at the corners, and stained with the grease of a fast food wrapper. It was the card the police officer had shoved into his pocket the night he was arrested. Elijah looked at the card, then let it drop from his fingers. It fluttered through the air in slow motion, landing softly on the floor between Sterling's knees. "You have the right to remain silent," Elijah recited from memory, his voice cold as liquid nitrogen. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you." Elijah leaned down, just an inch from the judge's face. "I suggest you start reading, Harrison. You're going to need a public defender. I hear Miss Kinsley is very good, but she's currently busy representing an innocent man." Sterling stared at the card, his spirit finally breaking. He slumped forward, sobbing into the floor, a broken heap of corruption. "Get him out of here," Agent Vaughan ordered. The agents hauled Sterling to his feet. He was dead weight, his feet dragging across the floor as they marched him toward the rear exit. The flashbulbs of smartphones went off like strobes. The gallery didn't just applaud, they stomped their feet, a rhythmic, thundering ovation that shook the walls of the courthouse. Beatrice Kinsley turned to Elijah, tears streaming down her face. She wrapped him in a fierce hug. "You did it," she whispered into his ear. "You actually did it." Professor Hemlock walked over, leaning heavily on his cane, a wide, incredulous grin on his face. "In 40 years of academia," Hemlock said, shouting over the noise of the crowd, "I have never seen a variable resolved quite like that." Elijah watched the doors swing shut behind the weeping judge. He adjusted his hoodie, took a deep breath of the air that suddenly felt cleaner, and turned to his lawyer. "Can we go now?" Elijah asked. "I have a lot of physics to catch up on." The weeks following the arrest of Judge Harrison Sterling were not just a news cycle. They were a cultural earthquake. The footage of the incident, specifically the moment the poor boy dropped the Miranda rights card at the feet of the weeping judge, became the most downloaded video in the history of the state. It was projected onto buildings during protests. It was remixed into songs. It became a symbol of a rotting system finally collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. But for Elijah Washington, the noise outside was just another variable to be filtered out. The real story wasn't happening on the news channels, which were busy dissecting the collapse of the Sterling and Cumberter's empire. The real story was happening in a quiet, dust-mote-filled office on the 4th floor of the Columbia State Physics Department. Elijah sat at a desk that was 3 times the size of the kitchen table he had grown up with. It was covered in stacks of paper, peer-reviewed journals, grant applications, and letters from Ivy League universities begging him to transfer. "You're squinting again," Professor Hemlock said, walking in with 2 mugs of tea. "I told you to get your prescription checked. You have full medical coverage now, Elijah. Use it." Elijah looked up, rubbing his eyes. He wasn't wearing the hoodie anymore. He wore a simple button-down shirt, crisp and clean. He looked older, not because of time, but because the constant, grinding stress of survival had finally lifted from his shoulders. "I'm not squinting because of my eyes," Elijah said, tapping the paper in front of him. "I'm squinting because this derivation for the magnetic containment field, it's clumsy." Hemlock chuckled, setting the tea down. That clumsy derivation was written by Dr. Richard Feynman in 1965. Most physicists consider it poetry. "It's poetry with a stutter," Elijah murmured, picking up a pen. "If I apply the topological dampener here and invert the matrix," he scribbled for 10 seconds. "There," Elijah said. "Now it flows." Hemlock looked at the paper. He didn't even bother to check the math anymore. He knew it was right. In the 6 months since the trial, Elijah hadn't just caught up to the curriculum. He had devoured it and was now rewriting it. "You know," Hemlock said softly, sitting on the edge of the desk, "the dean wants to name the new wing after you. The Washington Center for Advanced Energy." Elijah stopped writing. He looked out the window, where the autumn leaves were turning gold across the campus. It was a view he used to look at from the other side of the fence, while collecting cans to buy food. "No," Elijah said. "No?" Hemlock raised an eyebrow. "It's a great honor." "Name it after Beatrice," Elijah said firmly. "Beatrice Kinsley. She's the one who stood in front of me when the bailiff tried to put me in cuffs. I did the math. She did the saving. The fall of the Titan. While Elijah was debating the names of buildings, Harrison Sterling was learning the geometry of a 6x8 cell. The karma that hit Sterling wasn't swift. It was slow, grinding, and excruciatingly public. The FBI investigation, led by Agent Vaughn, had pulled a thread that unraveled the entire tapestry of the city's judicial corruption. They found the offshore accounts. They found the emails where Sterling mocked defendants by name. They found the kickback ledger, where he recorded payments from private prisons for giving harsher sentences to juvenile offenders to keep the beds full. Sterling was denied bail. The judge presiding over his arraignment was a woman named Judge Althea Reynolds, a woman Sterling had passed over for promotion 3 times because he claimed she lacked the temperament. She set his bail at $15 million, the exact amount he had tried to steal from the university project. He couldn't pay it. His assets were frozen. His wife, Martha, had attempted to board a flight to Zurich with a suitcase full of bearer bonds, but was intercepted by TSA agents who recognized her from the viral video. She turned state's witness against her husband within 4 hours of being in custody. Sterling was placed in the general population of the monstrous penitentiary he had helped expand. Prison is a place of rigorous social hierarchy, and Judge Sterling quickly found himself at the absolute bottom. He wasn't just a former judge. He was the judge who had put half the cell block inside. He spent his days in protective isolation, but isolation in prison is its own form of torture. It is a box of silence where the mind eats itself. Every time the guard walked by, a young black man who reminded him painfully of Elijah, Sterling would flinch. He lost 20 pounds. His hair turned snow white. The arrogance that had fueled him for 60 years evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling old man who wept when the lights went out. But the final blow didn't come from a shank or a fist. It came from a television. One evening, 6 months into his sentence, The guards allowed the inmates to watch the evening news in the common area. Sterling watched from behind the safety of a glass partition. The news anchor was beaming. Tonight, a historic moment for our city. The Aegis energy grid was officially activated today. The revolutionary system, which promises to reduce the city's carbon footprint to near zero and lower electricity bills by 80% for low-income neighborhoods, was designed by local prodigy Elijah Washington. The screen cut to footage of the ceremony. There was the mayor, there was the governor, and there, standing at the podium, was Elijah. He looked strong. He looked dignified. "This grid," Elijah said into the microphone, his voice steady, "belongs to the people. It belongs to the grandmothers who need oxygen machines. It belongs to the students studying by candlelight. It is not for profit. It is for power. Real power." The camera panned out to show the crowd cheering, and in the front row, wiping tears from their faces, were the families of the boys Judge Sterling had wrongfully incarcerated. In his cell, Sterling watched the boy he had called a delinquent and a vandal save the city he had claimed to protect. Sterling turned away from the screen, curled up on his cot, and faced the wall. For the first time in his life, he understood the true definition of a life sentence. It wasn't about time. It was about irrelevance. He was forgotten. Elijah was history. The reality behind the story years passed. The story of the judge and the genius became an urban legend, then a case study in law schools, and finally a part of the city's folklore. But this isn't just a story. The reality of what happened to Elijah Washington, whose real name was protected for years under the pseudonym Elijah to shield him from the media frenzy, is even more extraordinary. The Elijah of our story is based on the life of Dr. Isaiah West. In real life, Isaiah grew up in the shadow of a failing infrastructure system in the late 1990s. He was a janitor at a prestigious technical institute, much like the character in the story. He was arrested in 2004 for misuse of university equipment after being caught running simulations on the university mainframes at night. The judge in his real case, a man known for harsh sentencing disparities, was prepared to give him 3 years for grand larceny, arguing the computing time he stole was worth thousands. However, the Professor Hemlock figure was a real man named Dr. Arthur P. Lowry. Dr. Lowry intervened, testified that the stolen computing time had resulted in a patch for a kernel panic issue the university had been fighting for years. Dr. West didn't just go to college, he revolutionized the field of renewable energy storage. If you look up the West Lowry battery cell today, you will find it in almost every electric bus in major metropolitan areas. It is the technology that allows heavy transport to run on clean energy. The Judge Sterling figure? He was disbarred in 2008 following a corruption scandal involving kickbacks from a private juvenile detention center construction project. He died of a heart attack in 2012, alone and bankrupt. But in our story's timeline, we get to see the final meeting. 5 years after the trial, Elijah Washington, now a PhD candidate and the youngest recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant, received a letter from the state penitentiary. It was a visitation request. Elijah debated throwing it away. Beatrice, now the head of the public defender's office, told him he didn't owe Sterling a thing. Professor Hemlock told him it was a waste of time. But Elijah went. He sat on the metal stool in the visitation room. On the other side of the glass sat Harrison Sterling. The man was a ghost. His skin was grey, his eyes sunken. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by his own conscience. Sterling picked up the phone. His hand shook so badly he almost dropped it. "Elijah," Sterling rasped. "Dr. Washington," Elijah corrected him, his voice calm. Dr. Washington, Sterling repeated, tasting the ash of the words. I wanted to ask you something. For 5 years I have sat in this box. I have read every book in the library. I have tried to understand. Understand what? Elijah asked. How? Sterling asked, tears welling up in his eyes. You came from nothing. You had no father, no money, no school. I had everything. Top of my class at Yale. A legacy. How did you see what I couldn't? How did you see the math when all I saw was garbage? Elijah looked at the broken man. He didn't feel anger anymore. He just felt pity. You're looking at it wrong, Harrison, Elijah said, using the judge's first name for the first time. You spent your whole life thinking intelligence was about what you could keep, what you could hoard, your status, your money, your power. Elijah leaned in close to the glass. But genius isn't about hoarding. It's about connection. I saw the math because I needed to save my nana. I saw the patterns because I had to survive them. You were so busy looking down on everyone that you forgot to look around. Sterling bowed his head, sobbing quietly. I wasted my life, Sterling whispered. Yes, Elijah said brutally. You did. But you served a purpose. Sterling looked up. What purpose? You were the variable I had to solve, Elijah said, standing up. And now that I've solved it, I can move on to the next problem. Elijah hung up the phone. He didn't look back as he walked out of the prison. The legacy. Elijah walked out into the bright sunlight of the parking lot. A sleek electric car was waiting for him, a prototype running on his own battery design. Beatrice was leaning against it, smiling. How was it? She asked. Done, Elijah said. It's done. He got in the car. As they drove away, leaving the grey walls of the prison behind, they passed a group of kids playing basketball on a court in the projects. One of the kids, a skinny boy in a faded hoodie, stopped dribbling and watched the car drive by. Elijah saw him. He rolled down the window. Hey! Elijah shouted. The boy froze, looking terrified. Don't let them tell you who you are! Elijah yelled over the wind. Read the books! Read everything! The boy watched the car disappear around the bend. He looked down at the basketball, then over at the public library across the street. He dropped the ball. He walked toward the library. The cycle was broken. The variable was fixed. And the equation of justice, finally, was balanced. And that is the incredible story of Elijah Washington. A boy who used his mind to defeat a system designed to destroy him. It's a powerful reminder that true genius can come from the most unexpected places, and that arrogance is often the architect of its own downfall. Judge Sterling thought he was the law, but he forgot that the laws of physics and the laws of karma apply to everyone. Elijah didn't just prove his innocence, he proved that potential is distributed equally, even if opportunity is not. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel share these important stories. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale of justice served. And tell me in the comments, do you think the judge got what he deserved, or was his punishment too light? I'll be reading your replies. Thanks for watching. And remember, stay curious, stay kind, and never judge a book by its cover.